OK。OK。おはようございます。はじめまして。本日はお忙しい本日はお忙しいところで、ご来場いただきましてありがとうございます。プレストンソと申します。ガッツビ社の代表をさせていただいております。はい。それでは始めさせていただきたいと思います。OK、CMS の新しいパラダックス。はい。In English, the new CMS paradox, coming conflicts in content management. Once again, thank you very much. Good morning. My name is Preston. So it's my pleasure to be here today in Tokyo. This is a presentation I gave last week in Nagoya as well, at the Den Camp in Nagoya. So thank you so much for being here today with me. As you may know, I am the author of the book Decoupled Drupal in Practice, which is currently the only book available that is comprehensively covering Decoupled Drupal and API-first Drupal. If you would like, let me see, what's the problem with this? There's some missing part on the left here. Oh, okay. I don't know what's going on. Well, it should be okay. I can continue. It should be fine because there's not much content on the left side, so 大丈夫ですね。So, by the way, I also run a conference in New York City called Decoupled Days. I highly would recommend and invite all of you to come to that conference. It's the only conference about decoupled Drupal until this one, for the first time in the world. So this is the content that we'll cover today. I want to talk about some of the different people that we have to serve as developers who are working with a variety of different companies that are our customers. The first is the relationship that is very uneasy right now between the content editors and the developers that are working with us on making sure that they can use Drupal. I also want to talk briefly about the new world of CMS today. One of the things that has emerged over the last few years is this new idea of a decoupled CMS, headless CMS, and what does that mean for the future of Drupal and what Drupal needs to do in order to prepare for that future. I also want to talk about a term that I've been promulgating over the course of the last year or two called the distributed CMS. And this is a key idea that is part of a lot of new ideas around architecture that people have now been working on around the space. And then finally, I want to talk about some of the ways in which now a lot of the engineering teams and a lot of the development teams that are working with Drupal are now at odds, are now in conflict and having a lot of tension because of this new paradox that we see in the CMS world. So let's start with some of the problems between the content editors that we work with on a daily basis and developers. Drupal and other traditional CMSs like WordPress and other CMSs are experiencing some divergent priorities, some changes in the ways that people want to use the CMS and want to work with the CMS. One of the things that we've seen is that not only do content editors want to have control over websites in general, they also want to have control over other experiences like mobile applications and conversational interfaces like chatbots. That's one of the key questions that I had to answer at Acquia was, what exactly can we do to make sure that our content editors can still have proper influence over these new interfaces like chatbots and other such experiences? One of the things that I like to compare the current range of digital experiences to is kind of the Cambrian explosion of life forms that has that happened several hundred million years ago. And the reason for that is that we've never seen such a large variety of new digital experiences emerging on the market. This means things like mobile applications. We now have many different folks who are building mobile applications on Drupal. Also, set-top boxes. You now have examples of Apple TV or Samsung TV that are being used, or Roku, for example, that are being used to work with Drupal. Also, wearable devices. So things like your Apple Watch or your Fitbit. These are also things that need to be able to consume content from Drupal. And digital signage as well. Digital signage is one of the things that Acquia has worked on, for example. Many people are working with digital signage these days. And of course, augmented reality, which is another kind of new experience that has emerged. And the biggest message that I always like to really stress during this section of this presentation is that we don't know where the future is going to lead. There's always going to be new experiences, new kinds of devices that are emerging. Also, of course, we now have Amazon Alexa. I was part of a team that built the first Alexa skill for Drupal at Acquia. And Alexa is becoming very quickly not only well-known in America, but also around the world. There's now just been announced the capability to work with Alexa for Brazilian Portuguese. And of course, there are now also similar devices emerging here in Japan. So we know, once again, that one of the big problems here is that we're facing two different problems, two different conflicts. The first is that we already have to serve the content editors who are working on their websites in Drupal. But we also know that increasingly, many of us as developers are learning Gatsby, like yesterday, and we're starting to see this transition towards more and more decoupled front ends and decoupled user experiences. What that means for content editors is that you lose a lot of the functionality, as we know. And I know that the next presentation right after this will actually be from Mariyama-san, which will be presenting about why decoupled Drupal may not be the best choice. So one of the things that is a big problem, just to illustrate this, is that we have this problem where, first of all, if you are a content editor, you only have access to this very small amount of experiences in order to edit and manipulate and change the appearance of these experiences. If you're a developer, however, you have the ability to work with any of these up here. So you can write code, write custom applications that work with any of these other experiences. But we're leaving behind all of the marketing teams and the content editors. I actually had a meeting just over the week, just yesterday, with a customer here in Japan, in Shiodome, that is having this exact problem, where they have folks who are working on the actual content editing of a website who want to be able to change the output on an Angular website or on an Ember website or on a Gatsby website. But they're finding it very difficult because of the challenges in making this integration work. And having to do those kinds of projects is becoming very difficult. And so one of the issues that came up, of course, is performance. But there is a lot to be said about the improvements to the developer experience. But I want to be clear that this doesn't necessarily solve for the marketing teams and the content editors who need to be able to work with these interfaces, especially when CMSs like Drupal already have a full Japanese translation or a full multilingual translation available for other users to use. So the difference here, let's talk a bit about the developer. Let's talk about who the developer is and what they want from all of this kind of world. We know that there's this tension. We know that people are moving past this world. Developers want several things. The first is that they want their experiences to be affordable. One of the things that we're finding today with Drupal is that the total cost of ownership, the TCO of a Drupal website, is expanding rapidly. It's not unheard of now to have websites that are hosted on Acquia or on Pantheon or on other platforms that cost more than 6 or 7 figures sometimes. And this is not something that's a sustainable cost for many organizations. Also, there are now emerging cloud solutions that are part of the serverless market. This is like Netlify or Zeit. I know that Netlify has been gaining popularity here in Japan as well. And that's because of the fact they're much cheaper. And you can save a lot of the expenses that you would have paying one of these traditional hosting companies by leveraging one of these other smaller companies. Also, we know now that one of the challenges is that Drupal developers and WordPress developers and these CMS specialists are becoming very expensive to hire and to contract. The demand is very high, and that means that we can also charge very high prices. But what that means for those of us who are trying to hire these developers is that they're unaffordable. They're frankly too expensive for most people who are building small or medium-sized Drupal websites to actually afford. So you have this growing gap between the lower end of the market and the higher end of the market. Also, resourcing is becoming more and more restrictive. One of the problems now is that many of these technologies are becoming harder and harder for new developers to enter into. And we know, for example, that PHP is no longer a language that is taught in most coding programs. Also, this idea of a monolithic CMS, namely Drupal, which means that all of the parts of the CMS are not separable, becomes a very big problem, because that means that we can't easily switch out some of these solutions that we've been using. If you have a module that you've been using in Drupal and you take it out and you replace it with a different one, there's no guarantee that that module will stay stable for many years. And so this is why a lot of these interchangeable services are in vogue, are in fashion. A lot of new companies are emerging that are now producing these kinds of services that are easily taken out and replaced for others. Also, performance, as I mentioned, one of the biggest issues today is that Drupal has been getting better at this. Obviously, the traditional approach to Drupal, thanks to BigPipe, thanks to the caching system now in Drupal 8, thanks to a lot of the work that people have done with the refresh list module, and so on and so forth, performance is becoming much less of an issue in Drupal in terms of this expectation of interactive experiences. However, one of the biggest problems that we see is that there's still a lack, there's still a distance between the most modern solutions today, like Gatsby, or like some of the other serverless solutions, and now what's been happening with Drupal. There's no image lazy loading, for example, that is very optimized for this kind of a future. And what this means is that what I found, for example, is this is leading to a lot of issues, because not only if you're using Drupal for the API and for consuming the API, you're actually having now a lot of issues with some of the relationships between not only what you have in terms of your data in your front-end application, but how you get certain things in your Drupal site. So certain entity information, certain media entities, for example. How do you put those into your front end in a way that is performant? Also security. Just this week, there was a very significant security vulnerability announced for a very popular Drupal 7 module. And this is a very big problem that's been coming up more and more often. We have a very good and dedicated security team in Drupal that are working very hard and have been working very hard for many years. But we know for a fact that one of the reasons why headless CMS and decoupled architectures are so popular is because of their improvements to security outcomes. We know that a headless CMS architecture actually helps with security because there's no way to access the entire system from one single entry point. You have to actually work with multiple systems now and try to target both of those at the same time. So the question that I wanted to ask, and the question I also asked in Nagoya, is it possible to actually satisfy the requirements of both of these two bases of users, both the marketing teams and design teams, but also the engineers and developers who now want different kinds of experiences? But we know that there are several things that remain true. The first is that everyone in the developer community knows that data and presentation, the separation of concerns, is still an important focus. So let's talk a little bit about what other CMSs have been doing. I think this is a very good point to look back at the history of CMS and see how far we've come. There's a kind of CMS that I like to refer to as the static CMS. This is the very first generation of CMSs. CMSs like movable type, or CMSs that were produced by companies like Percussion back in the day. These are CMSs that really were kind of glorified static site generators. They weren't really very involved in terms of what you could do. And there wasn't any client-side behavior. And this is actually one of the reasons why I argue that potentially the CMS may have evolved a little too early in the history of software, because if we had maybe waited a little bit to build the CMS, which of course wouldn't have happened, but if we had waited a little bit longer, maybe some of these ideas would have been much easier to solve for. And then we have what I call the dynamic or the monolithic CMS, which is this idea of introducing dynamic behavior into the server side for the first time. So no longer was it just a flat file CMS or a flat file manager or kind of this very rudimentary experience. Now you have this idea of abstracting out a lot of this information that you're getting from the database and moving it to a rendering pipeline that is working dynamically on the server side. So you have all of this work going on to actually transform the data that you have. And this also introduces, thanks to Drupal, thanks to WordPress, jQuery, Ajax, some of the new client-side behavior that you increasingly see these days. Then you have the third wave of the CMS, which is kind of the headless CMS or the decoupled CMS. And these are now really serving the purpose of dynamic client-side applications. The very first idea behind the headless or decoupled CMS actually came from the idea of a backend as a service. There was this kind of platform that existed about 10 years ago, roughly until about 6 years ago, that was the mobile backend as a service. Many mobile applications found that a lot of the APIs that they were using traditionally were very, very poorly equipped to be able to work with very fast-moving and interactive client-side applications like on mobile devices. So we now, of course, at the same time, have this emergence of Node.js and universal JavaScript, this evolution towards an idea of decoupling from an architectural standpoint. And this means that a lot of the interactive behavior that we see in JavaScript is now becoming more and more common. And we now introduce a lot more challenges into how this happens. One very good example of this kind of headless CMS is Contentful. Contentful is something that I've been talking about with many people this whole time I've been here in Japan. It's a very interesting platform, but also lacking in many ways. Many content editors that I speak to actually really don't like the Contentful experience because the preview is very hard. And there's no way to have a contextual experience that actually brings you all the way back to how to administer the CMS. Prismic is another very interesting example because Prismic started to solve the problem of how can we give back some of these features that we have now lost because of headless CMS. How can we add back some key features that editors need? One of the ideas that Prismic introduced that was revolutionary, not really revolutionary, but very important to the success of Prismic was the idea of an injectable edit button. If you had on your JavaScript application a component that had a relationship to content in Prismic's CMS, using a JavaScript JavaScript module and using a data attribute, you could actually force the Prismic CMS to recognize exactly where that is on the page and provide a link back to that edit page in the CMS. And this is actually a very underutilized feature in Prismic, but it's something that really changed a lot of how people were using CMSs and very much was a step ahead of Contentful's capabilities. Sanity, meanwhile, is a CMS that has really been focused on the developer persona. They've really been focused on this idea of how can we make building a CMS and architecting a CMS much easier for the developer themselves. With Sanity, you actually write code to write your content model out. It's a very different approach from what Drupal provides out of the box. And of course, we have the two most well-known examples to us, which are headless WordPress and decoupled Drupal. So as we know, Decoupled Drupal is using Drupal as a source of data for other consumer applications or other systems, other devices. And one of the things that we know about Decoupled Drupal is that there are really two reasons why it became so popular within the Drupal community. The first is this idea of universal JavaScript, this idea of having Node.js, of having server-side JavaScript, of being able to leverage server-side rendering to provide better performance outcomes for your JavaScript frameworks. And also the fact that we have seen it, that I've seen at Acquia, my former job at Acquia, around this proliferation of digital experiences. So mobile applications, Alexa, Roku apps, all of these different kinds of experiences that we know that people need. So these dual forces are very powerful because no longer were customers just asking us for a website. A website is no longer enough. They need more, the user needs more on the JavaScript side, and the user needs more on the chatbot side or the other experiences that they need. So the idea of interchangeable parts is one of the most compelling ideas that has changed manufacturing and industry, not only in America, but also here in Japan. The idea of being able to produce a certain type of device or a certain tool with parts that can be interchanged for one another very easily. And this is a very common model that we now see in manufacturing around the world. Let's talk about how interchangeable parts has become a very strong influence on the ways in which we work today as developers on real client projects that we see. The first is that in the old days, one of the things that you had to do was because Drupal is a single monolithic system, and because oftentimes as a Drupal themer or a Drupal front-end developer, you have requirements that can only be provided by the Drupal developer who's building out that kind of provision in PHP, you were oftentimes blocked by the back-end developer. You would wait for a variable to be provided to you so that you could use that in your Twig template. You would have to wait because you don't necessarily have the ability to go directly in and write something different for this to be provided in the front end. When you actually decouple Drupal or you use a headless CMS, you enter a paradigm known as pipeline development. And pipeline development is a very common term now in Silicon Valley and in many other places, which is this idea that you no longer have to block one another. You can work simultaneously at the same time and not have to be an obstacle for the other team. Also, interchangeable presentation layers. One of the things that I've spoken to a lot of people who are Drupal users about is this idea that you can take a particular JavaScript front end, like Vue.js, like Ember.js, and you can very easily switch it out for a different front end. And this is a very remarkable idea because one of the biggest problems, one of the biggest obstacles for many people who were building Drupal sites is that they would have to wait years before they were finally ready to upgrade to Drupal 8. And this is why we still see many sites that are on Drupal 7 and haven't made the jump to Drupal 8. But with interchangeable presentation layers, you don't necessarily need to worry as much about that because if things are changing very quickly on the front end, for example, now there's Svelte.js, which is very popular in the JavaScript community. Now you can switch out whatever front end you have, be it Gatsby, be it Vue.js, be it Gritsum, for a different front end that you prefer. And there's another idea that's related to pipeline development that I want to really focus on because this is how I see the vast majority of many new projects being built today, which is that this idea of API convergence has become very popular, which is that let's take tools that exist out in the wild, like OpenAPI, or which was formerly known as Swagger, or some of these kind of dummy API tools, these API specification builders, that help us actually agree on the API that we want at the beginning. So we agree on that transaction layer, we agree on that communication protocol level. And then once that API is agreed on, it's a fake API. We can test against it as front-end developers, and the back-end developers understand that that's what they have to build. And then now they can build towards this real API that is authentic and actually works, and finally allows them to actually converge on the same outcome. And this is a very different kind of approach. You can see that this is a very non-waterfall approach to the way that web development projects oftentimes work today. I see many agencies, by the way, using that exact model, especially in the JavaScript world. Then we also have this idea of decoupled updates. As I said, one of the nice things about this idea of pipeline development is that you can now move away from some of this idea of blocking all of your work on the fact that you have to update Drupal. Now you can decouple your updates. So you can actually wait to update Drupal until there's another version ready. Same thing with Gatsby. You can wait to update until Gatsby version 3 is available. So let's talk about this term. This is a term that I first introduced earlier this year in Romania, and has been something that I've been working on in terms of writing about and speaking about for the rest of the year. The fourth wave, what I argue is the current generation of the CMS, is what I call the distributed CMS. And to stress the difference between the decoupled CMS in its current state and what I call the distributed CMS, consider the fact that in the decoupled CMS, what we're really doing is we're decoupling the architecture of the CMS. We're saying these layers are completely separated out into their own purposes and their own areas and their own concerns. In the distributed CMS, the primary difference is that rather than decoupling just the architecture, you're also decoupling the presentation layer itself. You're decoupling the page. And I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by that in just a little bit. One of the nice things about this idea is that you have this client-side behavior, the interactivity that users want today, as a first-class concern, as a primary concern of these projects. And the second thing you're also seeing is that a lot of these projects are now focusing on performance as their primary consideration. Gatsby, for example, focuses on performance first and foremost as the most important outcome for that project. And the reason why is because they're actually able to provide a server-side render that allows for the browser to receive very quickly and paint very quickly what they need for the user to see. So there's also this idea of what's called a content mesh. I talked about this in Nagoya as well. But early in the 2000s, mid-2000s, there was this idea of a service mesh. And a service mesh was this idea that rather than having one single monolithic backend that was the server and the base for all of your data and everything that you have to do with that data, instead you have a variety of different microservices. And so this really was the beginning of services-oriented architectures, and part of the reason why Decoupled Drupal came to be as well. But there's now this idea of a content mesh as well, where we have a single front end, or a variety of front ends if you want, that have the exact same relationship with many different services, but those services can be anywhere and of any kind of character. So as a result of using this approach, the page becomes decoupled itself as well. And I know that this is a lot of text, but let me just illustrate what I mean by this for a little bit. One of the things that we know about Drupal is that the traditional CMS, or the monolithic CMS, Drupal, handles all of the things that we need for us, whether it's user login, or search, or Uber cart, the e-commerce components that we need, whether it's content, or forms, or analytics. All of these are things that up until now have been provided by Drupal without any additional work or friction. But what happens when, for example, Uber cart, as we know, no longer exists, no longer is supported? If we are still using Uber cart, we're stuck. Because now we don't really have any other alternative, because we've been relying on solely what's inside the Drupal ecosystem to make this work. With the distributed CMS, with Gatsby, with a lot of these new models, what you see now is many of these new services that are emerging are becoming more popular, and in some ways are more powerful. One of the things I hear all the time from Gatsby users who were formerly using Drupal is they say, I really don't like Drupal search. It's not something that is interactive, it's not something that's very dynamic, out of the box. I can use Algolia, and I have auto suggestions, I have content previews directly in the search tool, I have everything I need to get going. It's very cheap, I only have to pay a few dollars a month, and it's something that is very well supported. And it's also something where I just build it and then it's done. I don't have to worry about it ever again after I've built the integration. And so this is why Gatsby has become so popular, is that many people are now using, for example, multiple kinds of systems in the back end. So Drupal back there, Contentful in the CMS as well as their CMS. But they're also using other kinds of systems as well, other platforms like Segment for analytics, Typeform to provide forms. Many people really don't want to use the Form API anymore for a variety of reasons. Typeform provides something like that for them instead. And many of you are probably saying, well, okay, this is fine, but Drupal already comes with all of this. Try Algolia out. Try Snipcart out. Try Typeform out. And you might be surprised at how far along these startups are compared to our existing solutions. So one of the transitions that we're seeing now is most of us are probably right here. Many of us are probably building a lot of CMS architectures that involve a single Drupal backend and a single front end using JavaScript. But the future, and what I've been seeing more and more in the Gatsby world, from brands like Impossible Foods or brands that are working with this like Harry's, they're using this model where they're saying, we only need this CMS for this purpose. We need this platform for this purpose. We need Algolia for this here. And they're finding that they have a lot more flexibility, because a lot of us were very concerned when UberCart was no longer supported. And we said, well, how are we supposed to transition easily onto another e-commerce platform? The nice thing about this kind of model is that anytime a venture goes out of business, you can now replace it with a different platform really easily, because you're only using that for a special part of the page. So what this means is that the affordability of the infrastructure goes way down. My personal site, for example, I use both Drupal 8. I use Drupal 8 for certain structured content. I use Contentful for rich text content on my personal site. But for my hosting, I actually use a Pantheon free tier site, which means I pay $0 to host my Drupal site, and I don't need a custom domain. And I pay $0 in hosting to Netlify because I'm using Gatsby as the front end. So I'm paying absolutely nothing, whereas before I was paying around $50 a month. With the Acquia discount, it was even cheaper. But back in the day, I was paying a lot of money to host my site, and now I'm paying absolutely nothing. But I still have access to all of these really great platforms. I have Contentful free tier to host my rich text and all my images and all my content in that front. I have Drupal to host a lot of my structured content that has much more complexity when it comes to what I need from the content type. And then, as for hosting, Netlify and Zeit are both free for a variety of use cases. I don't really need to pay more than that for hosting. And I haven't paid for hosting in over 6 months. So, as you can see, this is very popular, and many people are going in this direction. I hear, every single week, I hear a new company that says, we're going to this model because Netlify is cheaper, because Zeit is cheaper. Also, we know, and this is a little bit of a hard thing for a lot of us to admit in the Drupal community, is that, frankly, Drupal and PHP are not taught in universities anymore. Oftentimes I talk to a lot of my friends who are at coding boot camps now, who are just learning how to code, and they have never heard of Drupal. Everyone considers Drupal and PHP to be these obsolete languages and systems. We know that that's not true. We know PHP 7 is very performant. We know that Drupal 8 is the most powerful CMS out there. But optics matter. And this is something that I think a lot of us in the community are very hesitant to accept, is that optics do matter. The impressions that people have about our community and about the software that we provide do matter, not just the robustness of the software itself. And today it's true that JavaScript developers are much easier to find. It's true that PHP developers are more expensive. They're harder to find. PHP doesn't have as good of a reputation anymore. None of my friends who are working at their new jobs in web development companies and agencies are writing PHP at all. Most are writing maybe some Python, maybe some Ruby, but entirely JavaScript otherwise. So this means that a lot of companies, and I hear this once again every single week, many companies are finding that they can replace a single Drupal developer with 5 React developers. And more of the companies that we see in the Drupal ecosystem are now going in this direction. Many companies that formerly only had Drupal developers are now hiring React developers or training their developers to learn React, like Lullabot, for example, or like Tag1, or like Palantir. A lot of these companies are now working with more and more React developers and more JavaScript talent in a way that really we never expected to see a mere few years ago. Also, once again, flexibility. This idea that you can change out these things and change out these services at will based on whenever you need a replacement for each of these services means that decoupled pages are possible, not just decoupled architectures, but decoupled pages. And that actually is really impressive from a flexibility standpoint and also from a performance standpoint. Now, one of the kind of most important arguments against using Gatsby, against using a lot of these front-end projects, is gone. Gatsby, for example, provides you with a server-side render out of the box. It provides you with a highly performant flush to the browser, highly performant first paint, a highly performant experience at the initial load that many other systems simply cannot compete with anymore. And this means that with a lot of these serverless solutions, with a lot of the ways in which hosting has changed, we are actually finding that even with the performance benefits of Drupal 8, that Gatsby sites perform much faster and much better than those kinds of monolithic sites. Finally, security. And this is, I presented a similar presentation to this in Sofia, Bulgaria, a few months ago about this very topic. But the notion of the fact that you can actually spread out all of your security problems out to a variety of different services is very compelling. This is another thing I hear very often. I hear this probably every few days. People are switching to Gatsby and using this kind of interchangeable presentation component model because of the fact that they now no longer have to worry about security. And because of the approach that static site generators like Gatsby provide, you can actually render out your Gatsby site, serve it to the browser, shut down your Drupal CMS. So it's not accessible from outside of a certain IP anymore. You can firewall your CMS, you can shut down your CMS, the site is still online because you're fundamentally just using Gatsby as that front end. That means that you don't have any ability for anyone to access your CMS. And if you're using some of these different services like Algolia, Typeform, Segment, now somebody who wants to access all of that private data has to go out to each one of these platforms, each one of these services, to attack your entire architecture. It makes it very hard. And because of all these startups being focused on security of their respective projects, it's much more difficult to actually penetrate these architectures. So this is how we're seeing a change of terminology as well. We're no longer talking about decoupled CMS, we're talking about distributed CMS. And no longer are we talking about a content management system, we're talking about a content management stack. We're talking about architectures that are very rich. And now we're not just thinking about how we can introduce individual modules from Drupal into the page one by one. We're talking about how we can introduce new services into the stack. And this is a completely unprecedented paradigm that is emerging in CMS. And many people are now adopting this exact model around the world. And what's nice about this approach as well is that you can take your CMS and you can now use a single Drupal CMS to serve a whole variety of different front ends and different experiences that you might have. And that's also something that is very unexpected. And then content management stacks from this standpoint means that now you have your front end, you have your content mesh or your services that are third party or in-page services, and you have Drupal underneath that might unify all of your content in one place, if you so prefer. As I mentioned earlier, I don't use just Drupal anymore for my content because, as a matter of fact, the rich text handling that Contentful provides is many times actually often better than what I see coming out of Drupal, easily out of the box. So the content management system today is not a single system. It's not a single contiguous system anymore. It's a stack. It's distributed, it's multifaceted, it's diverse, it's spread out. It's something that is not a single architectural monolith anymore. So let's talk about briefly the kind of problems that we see. Because at the beginning I talked about how we have this problem between content editors and marketing teams and the developers who want this kind of experience for themselves, but don't necessarily acknowledge the fact that the people who are paying for these websites, the customers who want these websites, the content editors who need these experiences, are not able to work with. What we know is that in distributed CMS, these editors can keep their existing editorial interfaces. Drupal can remain part of your experience as a content editor. We have the hard work of the Admin UI initiative, for example. We also have the new Claro theme that is coming out into Drupal. And these are things that are really improving the editorial experience. But we know that for marketing teams, this is really hard. This is a really challenging kind of thing because marketers now need to learn about Avalia. They have to learn about how Typeform works. They have to learn about all these new services. And many of the people who I talked to today are very concerned about this for marketing teams. And that's the primary kind of concern I hear. If you're not a very developer-heavy team, you're finding this to be a very challenging approach because of the lack of a marketer-focused experience. Luckily, there's some solutions that are emerging. One of those is live preview with Gatsby. And this is actually a module that's available right now on Drupal.org, drupal.org/project/Gatsby. I believe there will be a session later today about this very topic and about Gatsby with Drupal. So that's one of the ways in which now there's this response. People are understanding that, okay, it's not enough just to provide for the developer experience. We have to make sure to offer preview, to offer some of these other kinds of things as well. So for marketers, this can be a very good option, but as you can see, there's kind of this new transition that we're seeing, but they can also lead to the loss of non-negotiable marketing features, these things that they cannot lose. And this right here is the biggest problem that we will need to solve if we want these architectures to succeed in the future. One of the things that we often talk about is preview. That's beginning to be solved thanks to Gatsby, thanks to a lot of different solutions that are out there. Layout management is now becoming a much bigger issue as well. But there's other things too that we want to solve for as well, or think about whether we need to incorporate them or not. Things like contextual links, which is still one of the most commonly used features in Drupal today. Or in-context editing, which is much less commonly used, but is still something that is desired by a lot of people in marketing teams and content editing teams. So this brings a very important question up for a lot of CMSs that are historical CMSs or traditional CMSs is, should CMSs decouple by default and choose a single framework? Should CMSs be entirely focused on data and abandon things like contextual links? What does that do to our optics? What does that do to our customer base? And what happens when these teams are subjected to this kind of growing feature loss that we often see? So there's no easy answers. Monolithic remains relevant, decoupled remains relevant. Distributed CMS is now also relevant to us for consideration. If you want more information, my site, Preston.so, I have a blog post that's very much about this presentation and talks about a lot of these ideas and a lot of these concerns. One of the things that we know is that it's good for your developers, and I know I'm running out of time, so I want to finish here, but consider the impacts that you might have on your customers and marketers. And we might need some of these solutions for these features that we've relied on for a very long time, and there will be more and more conflict because of this. And I want to recommend that everyone considers this architecture and these kinds of approaches and their effects on all users. ご清聴ありがとうございます。
一つだけ質問もしあれば、後でまた全体で質問しますけど、今聞いた範囲でもし質問があれば一つだけ。